complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right. John Slaughter, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. I'm glad to be on. I don't have to fake interview myself while I drive to work anymore.
Well, look, I'm glad to feed into your delusions of grandeur, right? So now it's not just you talking to yourself. You got a whole audience, right?
I look less crazy, I guess.
That's really the goal, right? Is you go on the internet to find other people, and so that way you're not just one guy ranting. It's several people ranting, and that makes it okay, right?
Well, I think we've it's been said to death, but we're yelling into the void.
Yeah, 100%. So you and I have actually known each other for a good amount of time, through the kind of, private Telegram chat that we're in. And I think really that I kind of, got to know you a little bit better, actually, when I was driving back from Paul Fahrenheit's house late at night. And I'll do this from time to time where I just kind of have open mic nights, when I'm driving on Telegram, right? And whoever wants to join the call, join the call. And you and I had a really interesting discussion then. Obviously, we'd been conversing before then. That was kind of the first time I really had a conversation with you. And I really, I took a lot from your perspective. So if you could you give, the audience kind of a brief description of, who you are and what you do on the internet?
Yeah, I run a Substack, and it's basically geared towards literature and philosophy. And I guess more the importance of narrative. I'm a husband and father. I'm a little bit older than a lot of the guys in the sphere, so I kind of looked at it like I have some real world knowledge, practical application to kind of throw out into the world. And really that's what I kind of try to do. So it's more my own musings, and hopefully people enjoy it. Well,
and you've said this, publicly. I believe it's in your bio on Twitter or on Substack or something. But you're kind of an interesting case because you're a Southern Catholic, right? And there's been a string of Southern Catholic writers and thinkers, and so I'm curious: have you always been Catholic, or was that something that you came to later in life?
No, I'm an adult convert, and it's a longer story, but I went through I grew up Southern Baptist, and I went through a very long and drawn out agnostic atheist phase from probably the time I was 16 until I was about 27, 28. And then I've always just had a huge interest in philosophy. Long story short, I started back with the pre-Socratics and kind of came to general deism, and just slowly over time, I think the deep intellectual tradition of Catholicism just called to me, and that's where I wound up.
No, fair enough. I think that's a pretty well-worn path. It's interesting, right? Because, and this is not at all what we're meant to talk about, but I can't stop myself, right? That there is this kind of feeling that we're all casting around for meaning. And I think that, it kind of leads to these odd kind of, mixtures, right? Because I'm not saying the history of Southern Catholicism is a relatively small one. It's a very Protestant area of the country. It's really the only majority Protestant area of the country. And that's the Bible Belt, right? And so it's it's an interesting perspective. But you and I aren't here, specifically to talk about that. We're actually here to talk about an author. So do you want to introduce, our topic for the evening?
Yeah, we want to talk about, obviously, Gene Wolfe and Book of the New Sun, which is, his magnum opus, right? And really it's a piece of, if you want to call it science fiction, it's kind of a melding of fantasy and sci-fi, but I would say it's high literature in the vein of James Joyce or Melville. And it's something that, as we talked about prior, it's something that people do not encounter very often. And it's really a shame considering how deep the text really is. I would, I mean, I guess you would say it's, well, like I said, it's James Joyce level, right? Or Melville. You can dive into that text over and over again. But it starts off pretty straightforward. It is the story of Severian, who is a torturer, who's kicked out of the Torturers Guild for showing mercy, essentially. And it's his journey from there onward. And it's told from the first person perspective. And, you find out very quickly that he's an unreliable narrator. And from there on, you're kind of trying to decipher, what Severian's telling you that's accurate, what's not accurate, and what's even relevant, because he's telling you everything he sees, right?
Right. And I think that it's an interesting thing to contrast this to the other, sci-fi series that I did a series of episodes on, which is, that Chinese series, right? The
three-body problem.
Because that's at the polar opposite. That's what's considered hard sci-fi, right? Where it's a lot of conversations about physics. And you mentioned that it's sort of an interweaving of science fiction and fantasy. And on one level, right, it is science fiction. It depicts, kind of Earth in the far future. But it is, technology has both progressed so far, and humanity in this future has regressed so far from its height that the barrier between magic and science and what even our characters themselves understand is sort of blurred. And there's sort of a surreal nature to it. When you combine this kind of incredibly powerful kind of like non-Euclidean technology, where there are rooms that are bigger than they appear from the outside, with a an unreliable narrator. It's an experience kind of unlike anything else. And you mentioned that it's very literary. And I think that when we talk about sci-fi, it's almost such a broad term that it's difficult to discuss. Sci-fi encapsulates this kind of like action adventure schlock. It encapsulates things like The Martian and the three-body problem, which are very science related. And then this, which shares certain motifs, right? That it is the far future, but it is that is very much in the background, right? That in some ways, this is almost a medieval tale, more than anything else. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Well, yeah, and it's one of those things that and this isn't really a spoiler because this happens, that you could actually read the book and never even pick up on this, but right from the beginning of the book, Severian's describing the tower he lives in, and if you pay attention really closely, you realize it's not actually a tower; it's a rocket, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's also a scene really soon after that, within the first couple of chapters, where he's standing. I forget where he's at, but he's looking at a picture, and he describes a knight with in armor with a golden helmet that goes all the way around him, right, all the way over his head. And he's describing an astronaut. It's a picture of an astronaut. Right. And so what Wolfe is doing right there in the beginning is you come into it thinking, okay, this is a fantasy novel, right? Because you got swords, you have all that. And then right from the beginning, he's giving you little hints that actually this is so far in the future that this technology, this space faring civilization no longer, they've lost the ability to do this.
And I think that it's interesting because it's the polar opposite of hard science fiction, where absolutely nothing is explained. And Wolfe does an interesting thing where he pulls names and terms from a wide variety of sources, right? So there can be, kind of like an animal or a creature. And it's, again, subtext that this is a world in which genetic engineering has gone on for a long time. So there are kind of entirely new species, either to be used as beasts of burden, and in every one he'll use, either a classical word to describe it, maybe a biological one, and it's clear that that's describing something, that doesn't exist, and he doesn't do the Tolkien thing, where he describes it in intricate detail. You sort of have to pick it up through the negative space almost, that you'll maybe hear. You'll read what's essentially a horse, and it will serve as a horse, right, for the story. And then, 2/3 of the way through your book, you'll read that it has, 3 pairs of legs, which is completely ancillary detail, but it's that sort of alienness and strangeness throughout the whole thing that I think is very interesting.
Right, and I think when you're reading it, he has those appendix in the back of at the end of each book, and he basically tells you, I think at some point, that he is actually translating this text from, like, he's received this text from the future backwards, and he's translating it. And the reason he's using a lot of these archaic terms or these esoteric terms is because he doesn't know what to use to describe these things. So he tries to pull terms that come as close as possible. And, like you were saying, what Wolfe does is he never makes up a single word. Every word he uses is a real word, but you have to go very far back in time to even find the meaning. And then the actual meaning of the word is only somewhat applicable to what he's describing, right? So it creates this sort of, like you said, it's not hard science fiction, it's more dreamlike. And then that paired with the prose, I would say Gene Wolfe's prose is also like high literature, right? And so those two things combined create like almost a dreamlike state when you're reading it.
Definitely. I think dreamlike is a good way to describe it. And you've written an article, which is linked in the description. It's a fairly short article about this book. And one of the things that you draw attention to is the abundance of Christian themes in this work. And there's a quote that I'm going to bring up, right? Which is, oh shoot, I've lost it. And you know what? Fair enough. I'll paraphrase it. How about that? And Gene Wolfe was not unaware of the Christian symbolism in his own work. And obviously, the main character in this work is an executioner, right? A torturer. And there are multiple scenes of torture in the book, which are not particularly pleasant, right? But Gene Wolfe, has this interview where he basically says, Christ is often described as a carpenter. But when you look at the symbols of Christ, right, the cross, the thorns, the nails, right, those are symbols of torture. Those aren't a carpenter's tools. And the character himself is sort of, and obviously not perfectly, right. He's a man, and in many ways, a morally compromised man, but he is sort of a Christ figure. So do you want to describe how our main character Severian is, at least in this work, a Christ analogy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's there's obviously a ton there to unpack. I mean, and it's been a hotly debated thing for a long time. I mean, Wolfe himself, in an interview at one point, I think actually said that he wasn't a Christ figure, but he was more of a saintly figure trying to act Christ-like. Which, I mean, I think it's kind of trying to thread a needle, I think, when you actually read it, because he does go through these processes, but he, I guess, are we giving spoilers?
Oh yeah, I think so at this point.
Okay.
I'll put it simply. You guys should read this book. It's very interesting. It's not a particularly difficult read. It'll suck you in. It's easy to find. And the spoilers, I mean, it's not the kind of book where knowing what happens at the end ruins it. It's an experience. But anyway, John, carry on. Okay,
so since we're gonna go spoilers, I kind of have to reveal the ending, at least of the first 4 books. Which, I mean, if you read I forget what the last one's called, but it goes more in detail with this. But it takes place on the Earth is dying because the sun is dying, right? And it's a red sun, and essentially the biggest Christ-like moment, I think, for Severian is the fact that he finds out at the end that he is essentially going to be the new sun, right? That he has to prove himself to these alien beings that have been behind the scenes sort of manipulating everything. And he has to present himself to these beings as sort of the representation of Earth. And if he fails, he'll be desexed, right? They'll castrate him, and that'll be it, right? The humanity will go into a deep freeze, and that it'll all be over. And so Severian's entire arc is for him to literally be the new sun and to sacrifice himself so that humanity can continue on. So I think that is the core of it, but there's obviously a lot more Christian allegory in there. I mean, you have the Eucharist, the dark Eucharist which I mean, it's dark, and on the surface, a lot of people who are Christian are going to take this the wrong way, but you have the cannibalism that occurs, right? Where he drinks the soup.
Right, and this is a kind of recurring motif through the book, right? Of kind of playing with mortality and memory, right? So as part of this, this kind of like ritualized cannibalism, and if you are familiar with other sci-fi, you'll notice that this is a motif that a lot of people steal from him, right? But essentially, it is the human body prepared in such a way, ingested with certain chemicals, that you kind of get some of that. You become that person. You imbibe their memories, along with their flesh. And you're right. It is kind of presented as a, kind of like a dark mirror image, of the Eucharist. And there are several moments of that. There is a character that is, raised from the dead, like Lazarus. But again, it's not perfect. There's something kind of wrong with it. And I think that's something that's, very evocative through the whole book, is that, Severian, like you said, saintly is probably a better way to describe him. But even then, he's not perfect by any means. There are multiple times in the book where he acts, kind of like very selfishly. And it's to the benefit of the book, right? I think that a lot of these, kind of hero's journey tales, where we have someone sacrifice themselves, for the good of humanity, can get very, very, I don't want to say black and white, but can get very, very, I don't know, flat.
Well, yeah, they're simple. And what Wolfe is doing is you can't have a true Christian redemption story with somebody who's already perfect, right? You almost have to dislike him in order to see the beauty in him transform.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to say it. The redemption wouldn't be nearly as interesting, if he was just this kind of like instant, square-jawed hero from start to end. And obviously those stories have a different purpose, but that's not what Gene Wolfe is getting at. So
no.
One of the other things that I think is really interesting in this is the figure of, are we saying conciliator? It's again, one of the many ways in which Wolfe kind of bends the English language is that he'll make words that are that are made out of words but aren't in super kind of common usage. Are we going to go with that pronunciation?
Yeah, I always thought conciliator or conciliator. Yeah, I either one I think would work.
Well, right. So do you want to describe how that character how that character is important in this setting, and how that kind of ties back to the Christ-like themes?
Well, yeah. So I mean, he's also the autarch, right? So like the conciliator, he is. I mean, he's essentially described as Christ, right? It talks about he walked the earth, thousands of years before. I think he had a face that shone like the sun or something like that, right? And he's left behind this artifact, which is essentially a religious relic, right? And it's carried around by this religious order. And I've again, pronunciations, the Pellerines, I believe is what they're called. And they're basically nuns, and they dress in all red, and they are traveling essentially a church, and they carry out these religious, it's basically like a mass for the conciliator. And there's the claw of the conciliator, which is, I believe it's described as what does Severian call it? He calls it a pyx, like PYX, right? Which is blue, which also ironically is also the name for what the box that holds the consecrated host, right? So even then he's describing it as basically a religious relic to this godlike character that came before him. And he picks it up and he carries it around with him, and he starts to have these miracles occur the same way that religious miracles are attributed to these these artifacts that are carried around, like you almost think of like the cross of, was it the cross of Jerusalem or the Jesus cross?
The true cup, or kind of a relic of a saint almost.
Right. Yeah. And then these, and you never really know. Even on my second reading, I still never figured out, like, is it the claw that's doing it, or is it Severian that it's working through, right? Because even when it breaks, it ends up being the thorn of a rose, right? So, but that character, essentially, the new sun, is going to be, it essentially plays the role of Jesus to God, right? He's the new sun coming in.
Right. And I think that kind of that ambiguity through the whole thing is really what makes it interesting, because there's kind of a good way and a bad way to do ambiguity. There's kind of a cop out, right? And I'm sure that, you're a literary man, you've read enough to get to this point where you can kind of tell that the author is just like, well, I don't know what's supposed to happen. I don't know how to get myself out of this corner that I've painted myself into. So ambiguous ending, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like The Sopranos, where it goes to black and you hear a gunshot and never find out what happens. But in this case, Wolfe is, I believe, using it very intentionally, to create, an atmosphere where things aren't definite. It's not like, other forms of sci-fi where you're kind of aware of the rules. And so when things happen that are kind of outside of what you've heard, it kind of shows you with each one a little bit more of, the setting and the character in a way that I haven't read in a lot of other fiction.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up that point, because there's a lot of, I guess you would say, literature or interviews with Wolfe where he's pretty open about the fact that he intentionally sets the text up so that it can be deconstructed, right? Because a lot of people would say, okay, it's a postmodern text, right? It's deconstructing all this, blah, 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 whatever. But Wolfe even says that he invites the deconstruction to deny the deconstruction. And he has this quote in the book that lines up perfectly with this, where he says, things act of themselves or not at all. So he makes this point that, like, you can read whatever you want into this, but it's not more than what it actually is, right? You can have your own interpretation, but that's wrong, which I think is a genius thing that he does.
Oh, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. That's because there is sort of a degree in which it's kind of a Chad move. Right?
Oh yeah, people underestimate how extremely well versed in a lot of the philosophy and especially religious, but dogma that he was actually, he was well versed in.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I should also say there's it's not his only work. Gene Wolfe has written, I believe, another series kind of set in a similar universe that's pretty good. It's not quite as good as this. I think that you described it, well, as his magnum opus. And it's a little bit confusing because depending on your edition, it either comes in 2 physical copies or 4. In mine, at least, it's a newer edition. So it's kind of 2, roughly 400-page books. But it doesn't matter much, right? You kind of have to have it, in one setting, so to speak. It doesn't really make quite as much sense as, the individual books, so to speak. But it's interesting, too, because when we meet Severian, right, there's this kind of inciting moment. And you've mentioned the character of, the autarch. And the autarch is sort of a almost, I don't want to say a god emperor, because that makes him sound more respected than he is, but sort of a hybrid religious and political figure. And, we learned that, the planet is not united. There are a number of different kind of forces and factions and kind of unclaimed territory. And when we open this, we kind of find our, main character, running around outside of, the tower as an apprentice of the torturers, right? And they're running through this, necropolis. And we've mentioned that, in this book that the sun is dying, that humanity is kind of grinding to a halt. And that's something that's mentioned over and over again in the discussion of the settings, because there are multiple places where there are towns that stretch on as far as the eye can see of empty houses, houses where, at least in living memory, no one has ever lived. The main city itself is kind of slowly dying and slowly migrating along a river. And this necropolis is kind of an example of that, right? Where there are these crumbling tombs stretching on kind of as far as the eye can see. And when the action kind of, kicks off, our main character is at kind of the center of an interaction between, guards who are set up to prevent, the robbery of corpses, and then sort of a band of rebels. So do you want to introduce, the character of Vodalus and kind of that part of the work?
Yeah, I think, Vodalus is obviously the interesting character because, like, he is a rebel leader, and they're grave robbing. They're stealing the body because they want to eat the body, right? Because this goes back to what we talked about before with the sort of the diabolical Eucharist, because they can live through that person's memory. I honestly, like, me reading through it, I never found Vodalus that interesting as much as I found the fact that he's being played by the autarch the entire time interesting, right? That nothing he's really doing matters because he's always controlled. So I think he almost serves more. I almost always saw him serving more as an example of, it's almost to me a commentary on like how political movements or rebel groups are just utilized by people above them to do what they want, right?
Well, right. And that's sort of a theme, because when he actually meets Vodalus the second time, he has a kind of a chance interaction with him. And there are multiple times when he's kind of, before he's met him again, where he kind of contemplates, like the unfairness of the world. Like, why am I, is this kind of, this torture, this executioner, just given people to do horrible things to, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. Some of them are probably, innocent. And there's one or two times where he basically says, like, that's why I support, this rebellion, right? Because they would be the ones to kind of set it right. And when we meet him, not only is he, the rebel Vodalus, completely uninterested. Like, he is very clear that he just wants to be in charge. Mm-hmm. It's very like all of the glamour around him falls away very, very quickly. But we do, as you're right, we learn that, this is kind of all part of the plan. That he is essentially serving the interests of the autarch, as kind of a puppet. And so I think that you're right to kind of point out that it is kind of a commentary on, political movements, but also just rebellion more generally, right? That sort of in like a Ted Kaczynski sense, like the system has already incorporated, a way for you to rebel that serves the interest of the system.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then even if he were to hypothetically succeed, which I guess you could say he almost does, the autarch is already setting Severian up to take that place, right? So he doesn't even really, I would say Vodalus doesn't even realize what he's fighting against at the end of the day. He, like you said, he just wants power. But of course, all that changes when you finish the book and the time travel element comes in, and then things kind of, I think that kind of changes it once you have to reread it because you see it differently.
One of the other things, and obviously I think you're right, but one of the other things that I thought was interesting reading back through this is that Gene Wolfe kind of pulls a fast one on you, because again, like I said, there's that moment where Severian kind of begins soul searching about, his job. And I'd read it once because, as I said, my late father-in-law, he's the one who handed me this book. So I read it, quite a few years ago. And I remember liking it, but there's always that danger, right, of coming back to a book that you really like, after you've matured a bit. And so I was actually kind of nervous. I didn't want to, come back to this book that I associated with a man that I, cared for greatly and be like, oh, this is awful. Like, why did I read this? I liked my memory more. But it's sort of setting up what, in a modern work would be, Severian basically becoming, kind of like the like the Antifa or like the SJW of this far future, just this like completely annoying character, right? But it's sort of a bait and switch, because obviously, he does, reflect on himself, but it's not necessarily, a particularly liberal book in that way. He doesn't, kind of, decide to never harm a hair on anyone's head again. He just keeps doing his job the whole time, independently to the plot of the book. And I think that that's interesting because I think it would be, kind of easy and cheap for Wolfe to have written it so that, Severian is essentially just a 21st, or I guess a 20th century person, in this alternate setting. But he seems very much kind of a man of his era and a man of kind of an alien era.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it also has to be said, he was raised in Torturers Guild. He doesn't know anything else. I mean, because even in his act of mercy, right, which again plays back to this whole Christ-like character that he is, right, he has a hard time showing mercy to her because it's so ingrained in him to not do that. And then, as you said, like even when he, sort of has his moments of reflection and feels bad about it to an extent, I think it's when you jump, I believe, into the third book. He's been, I forget which city it's in, but he's been there a while just carrying out executions, right?
Right. There's actually a whole part in the book, and I believe it's in the second one, where he just sits down talking to his readers, because this is presented kind of as his, his personal manuscript, where basically he's like, yeah, just assume if I'm not talking about this is what I'm doing, but I don't want like sickos getting off on it. It's sort of stated, almost that bluntly, that he's not going to turn this into like a, kind of like some like, sordid like exploitation. But yeah, it is interesting. And one of the other things that's just kind of a, I guess like a minor detail in the book, that kind of goes back to this theme, is that one of the assumptions in sci-fi that I consider kind of a branch, and if sci-fi doesn't have this premise, I like it. And if it does, I'm not as much of a fan. It is the idea of progress. Because when I think of sci-fi that I like, Dune, the three-body problem, all of it, and this very much has this idea that, technological progress and moral progress are not the same thing. And, in Dune, it kind of takes the form of the Butlerian jihad, right? A conscious stepping away from certain technologies. But in this book, there's actually a very interesting kind of simple example. And it's that essentially the autarch has decided that, people are moving around too much. So you're just not allowed to use roads. We still have roads, but you're not allowed to use them. And if we find you on roads, well, we just have like the road patrol who just murders people. It's sort of something almost like out of like Chinese history, right? Where it's like an incredibly arbitrary decision, enforced at like the most harsh level possible. But it is sort of and I don't want to, put too much meaning to this, but it is very much kind of a reactionary future.
Well, and it's interesting that you picked up on that, because if you haven't read, what's it called? Earth of the New Sun, I think, is the fifth and sixth one, that complete Book of the New Sun. When he gets up in interfaces with these aliens and all that are dictating everything, there's essentially a very clear anti transhumanism and accelerationism message in there, where like essentially humans are given these two choices, and one is to just like let them have all the technology they can possibly have and go as fast as they can until they lose their humanity, or they can slow down and go back. And that very much plays out, and it's pretty obvious, in my opinion, that Wolfe is sort of critiquing both accelerationism and transhumanism.
Well, in a way, critiquing, the premise of the genre itself, because there's this idea kind of latent, and you see it especially in things like Star Trek, right? Which is that, once humanity has technology, they will essentially just become intergalactic 1990s or 1960s shitlibs, And this is interesting because it's a world on which one hand is incredibly advanced, right? There's kind of interdimensional, there's time travel, there's there's all sorts of, it's essentially kind of magic in the, functionally. But, oh yeah, no, if someone commits a crime, we just cut their head off with a sword, in the public square. People still ride animals as kind of a way of normal conveyance. And, and that's why, we kind of have talked about, on one hand, it's sci-fi, and the other hand, it's fantasy. And it's interesting because, you mentioned, and I actually had not picked up on the fact that his tower is supposed to be a spaceship. Although I guess it makes sense the way it's described, that it's sort of there for you if you're interested, but it is not necessary. That understanding it adds depth, but it's not necessary to the narrative itself, which I approve of.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's, and I mean, to that point, Wolfe does this on such a deep level that, like, even with, you remember Dr. Talos?
Oh yeah, that's a very interesting character.
So there's like 5 times in the book where he describes Dr. Talos as a fox, right? And if you start reading into it, there's this whole like Kabbalah, like Jewish Kabbalah sort of, I guess, metaphysic that exists in this world he created, right? And it's, so the letters FOX in Kabbalah, I think it's like 6, 15, and 26, which becomes 666, right? So like he's telling you that Dr. Talos is essentially the devil who's manipulating Badlanders, is that how you say it?
Or Baldanders? I don't know.
Yeah, well, right, whatever. Anyways, he's manipulating him. Like, you kind of think it's the other way around, but then you figure out like Baldanders actually is breaking free from Dr. Talos at some point, right? So like he injects that in there where, yeah, you don't have to know that, but once you know it, you view the work completely differently.
This is and that's again, I hadn't picked up on the numerology in that, so I'm learning something as well. But this character, Dr. Talos, is part of, at least for the first 2, a troupe of kind of traveling performers, and perhaps the most based take in this entire book is that actors are essentially the devil, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's an interesting, the play that is acted out is actually interesting in its own right, because it's sort of its own narrative kind of alongside the book. And at different times you see different parts of the play, and at the end of the first volume, there's probably about 10 or 15 pages written as a stage play. And again, that character of Dr. Talos is fascinating because there's a minor character, named Jolenta, and they meet her essentially as a, kind of I think she works at a restaurant, right? And she's described as essentially a normal woman. And Dr. Talos has this described as almost this like supernatural ability to influence people. And he sort of seduces this woman away from her family, from her job, with the promise that he will make her beautiful. And he does. And when she, reappears after, a short absence, she's described as, so attractive that, no man can stop looking at her. Women, decide to, attempt to sleep with her. But her beauty is contrasted against other characters, right? That it's this kind of like sinister, sensual beauty. And when this character, over the course of it, eventually starts to deteriorate, we learn that what, this doctor has done is essentially kind of like crudely modify her body, with chemicals, with prosthetic parts. And there's kind of this really sobering, series of chapters as she just slowly falls apart and dies. And in a weird way, and maybe I'm stretching here, but it does kind of mesh with that transhumanist theme throughout the book, that you can kind of cheat and become more than human for a little bit, but it catches up with you. And obviously this wouldn't have been in the zeitgeist when Wolfe was writing this, but it very much kind of reminded me, of the kind of like radical transsexual surgery, right? Where you are becoming kind of more than your meat was meant to be from one level, but it's fake. It doesn't last. And when I think he refers to it as like the mesmer, when the magic wears off, it's apparent that this is kind of like a horrible surgical abomination. And then, this kind of pitiable character just dies.
Well, yeah, and I think it's very poignant because you also find out that Dr. Talos and Baldanders are actually experimenting on children, right? They're kidnapping children from the village, and they're basically playing Mr. Potato Head with them. And
Again,
so,
yeah, that's another
yes,
case in which.
so you have that same thing going on, which I mean is kind of obviously relevant to like what you were saying, right? They're going after these kids, right? And that's when he encounters them and he fights them in the I guess it's a repurposed castle or whatever. That's what they've been doing, and it's one of the darker parts, right? When you realize that essentially Baldanders is immortal, and they have basically been stealing children from this village and dismembering them and playing, doctor with them.
To me, the moment that he meets Baldanders, actually, it seemed like a reference to Moby Dick, because it's actually very similar to how Ishmael and Queequeg meet, right? Where they're kind of the inn is full, and so they have to share a bed. And I don't know if that's a stretch, but it seems, and obviously, Wolfe was well read enough that I wouldn't be surprised if that's a reference. Did you pick up on that?
Yeah, I actually, I'm being unprofessional by not having it in front of me, but there's a book that is a companion guide to Book of the New Sun, and chapter by chapter, it lists out like every literary reference, right? So, and stuff that you've never even heard of or I've never heard of, and it points that out, right? That is clearly a callback to that, because I mean that's there's so much of that in there that literally somebody sat down and wrote an entire book and went through every basically line.
Oh, and this is horrible podcasting, but you should send me the title of that in the private chat so I can read it, because that sounds incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I would go grab it off my bookshelf, but my kids are in there playing. So
no, fair enough, right? So yeah, it's part of the reason that I want to increase the visibility of this work, because you and I were talking about this, that when you talk about sci-fi classics, there are kind of, especially from our circles, certain titles that come up. I mentioned Dune. It's something that I quite like. Obviously, a lot of people read the 40K books, and those are a little bit schlockier, but they have some interesting ideas in them as well. But this is kind of an under-discussed, what I would consider a classic. And so, I'm curious, why do you think that this hasn't had kind of the same, cultural relevance that a lot of other, kind of like sci-fi works have had in our circle?
Well, I mean, I would say that on the surface level, it probably never got the critical acclaim, or it got the critical acclaim, but it never got the mainstream push that other works did, because the subject matter is so hard to deal with. Like we just talked about, you have Severian, and he never stops executing people, or even when he's with Jolenta, right? There's a scene in there where he kind of has his way with her, and it's left kind of ambiguous as to whether it was consensual, right? And so you have this character that's not easy to empathize with for anybody. And then on top of that, it jumps genres, and it's written in a dreamlike prose. And then it invites you, because what Wolfe is doing when he's writing that is he's trying to make literature from a passive to an active activity, right? He wants you to engage with reading and not just read passively. And so I think for the average person trying to pick that up, even though it won all these sci-fi awards, the average person just never could grasp it. Not because they physically can't, but because it's got a barrier of entry. You have to be willing. You almost have to have someone sell it to you, because that's how I came to it.
Right, and I think that's sort of why describing it as sci-fi is sort of inadequate. Because I think that when you think, or when someone describes themselves as a sci-fi fan, that oftentimes kind of means the schlockier material. And look, like I enjoy reading pulp, I enjoy reading schlock. I've talked about it quite a lot. But you could understand, right, how someone expecting that would be a little bit put off by this book, because you're right, it does require amount of active reading, and mental participation that you just don't often find in the genre.
Yeah, no, I truly think that it's not a far stretch to compare it to similar to reading like the Brothers Karamazov or something, right? Like you can read it, but you're not going to get what you can out of it if you don't sit down and actually push through it, right? And really, even with that, or with with Finnegan's Wake, or Moby Dick, it's the minute you finish it, it's inviting you to come back and reread it. So it almost requires a second read, and I think a lot of people don't want to do that, because I'm a Dune fan. I like Dune, but if I'm being honest, there's a lot of interesting ideas and philosophical exposition in Dune, but it's not that well written. It's very pulpy. It's very kind of choppy. The first book just kind of ends, right? It's not, in my opinion, I wouldn't call it a great work of literature, but it is, I guess, a great work of sci-fi, right?
Well, and I think that the prime example of that is, the Forever War, right? Which has some very interesting ideas in it, has some, motifs that will be, relevant in 50 years after it was written. But it's essentially, much kind of like Dune, like it's kind of it's a pulp novel with some interesting themes sprinkled in. And I think that the fact that the Dune series kind of takes a sharp turn off, kind of shows you that if anything, Dune was, kind of great in spite of Herbert almost, and then he kind of reverted to the mean, afterwards. And obviously, look, like I've never written a sci-fi novel, so, take my criticism for what it's worth. But yeah, I think that it does, stand, on its own, aside from kind of the conventions of the genre.
I agree. I honestly think that Messiah is better than Dune. I'm probably in the minority on that, but like after I read the first 3 Dune books, and I found Messiah actually better than the original Dune. So I tend to agree that. I don't know. I think, and I'm going to piss all the Dune fans off, but I think it's a little overrated.
Well, I think that Dune is overrated because of the context in which many people read it. That I think that it sort of like how a lot of people, the first like classic they read or the first literature they read is, Vonnegut or Fitzgerald, right? Which are relatively readable as far as, like American novels go. They get this kind of, there's a lot of people who have read that, and that might be the only thing they've read. And so it gets a ton of praise from people. And admittedly, they're good books, but when it's the only good book you've read, it sort of is in a different context. And I think that Dune is it's the bridge for a lot of people, right? Where you kind of move from, as a young man, especially from reading, books for children to kind of books for adults. And so I think, at least and that's how I read it, and I think others have described it like that as well. It kind of, because of that, occupies a special place in a lot of people's hearts.
Well, yeah. I mean, when I came to, not to turn this into a Dune show, but when I came to it, I was sold that it was this great thing. And I think the problem is your expectation, at least for me going into it, it's like, I'm expecting something great and it's okay. And so now I'm more disappointed than I ever would have been in the first place. But right. I think that's also part of the importance of trying to, it is really hard, even as we're doing it now, it's really hard to even describe what Book of the New Sun is, because it goes all over the place and it almost sounds schizophrenic when you're even describing it. But, there's this growing, literary tradition that's, or I guess, growing out of, this sphere, right? And you're seeing a lot of great writers, T.R. Hudson, and you have the Biz Archives and that pulp thing going. And kind of like part of the reason I keep trying to push people to read Book of the New Sun is because I'm hoping that somebody can write something like really high literature, Because I mean, I write on my own, but it's nothing fantastic. But there's probably somebody out there that'll pick this up and go, man, and then they can do something similar that people will read, for generations.
Well, definitely, man. And I think that's probably a pretty good place to leave Gene Wolfe and Book of the New Sun. You should read it. It's good enough and large enough that it's difficult to discuss in an hour. If we haven't sold you on it, you should have been sold on it. You should read it. And so John, as we're kind of bringing this to a close, what's a good place for people, to find you and to find your work?
You can find me on Twitter at tpropensity. You can find a link to my Substack there. It's at Texas John Slaughter at substack.com. And also, I got a new podcast with a couple of guys called The Fading Giant, which I'm sure will be linked in the description as well.
No, definitely. And I can say I listen to your podcast. I think it's fun. I enjoy it quite a lot. So that's worth your time. We have one super chat by a fellow co-host of your podcast, Scratchy, under his YouTube account, Douglas Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome. Apparently it's Kabbalah Week with Jay Burden, because you just wait till we talk about Neon Genesis Evangelion. That's true. I will be appearing on the YouTube channel linked in the description to talk about anime, which actually, much like sci-fi, I don't know if I call myself an anime fan, but Neon Genesis Evangelion sort of transcends the genre. So yeah, if you want to check us out, I'll be over there. And then Smear, John, tell us about when you fought the giant of Kandahar.
That's still top secret, man. I can't talk about that.
I think referencing your prior military service. But anyway, man, thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it. I think it's a good discussion. As far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And as I've said before, the show is sponsored by Axios Fitness. So we're starting a new season. And this one, I think, is actually of specific interest to me, because I texted JD and I was like, hey, I want to do this. Can you make a program for it? He's like, yeah, but you're going to have to sell it to people. And I was like, all right, well, fair enough. So as you may have heard, right, I got married, which has been great, but it has made it somewhat difficult to keep a svelte figure when you have someone who actually knows how to cook in the house. And so the next series of workouts, right, which is a flat fee, you get some workout planning, is designed around kind of weight loss and limited equipment. So if you're someone who could probably afford to lose a few pounds, but you don't have a lot of weight equipment, it's the perfect time to jump in. Just a flat fee, only pay once, and then you'll get programming for a couple weeks. You'll get to see everyone's progress. You'll get to see if I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to and kind of compare yourself against my performance. And if that sounds great, you can click the link in the description. And again, John, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.